Hey everyone, welcome to this Forge College Explainer. So today we are going to unpack the mechanical assembly line of Ethereum transactions. If you've ever found yourself wondering exactly when a transaction crosses the line from being just a hopeful wish to a permanent rock-solid reality on the blockchain, well, you're in the right place. We're going to break down the exact life cycle stages your transactions go through. Honestly, think about it like this. It's a lot like the difference between drafting an angry email and actually hitting the send button. Just like we tracked code commits back in our previous lesson, Foundations of Version Control Integration, today we really need to distinguish between a transaction's mere intent and its irreversible committed state. Typing that email, that's just your intent, but hitting send and watching it land in their inbox, that's the committed state. And once it's sent, there's no taking it back. All right, let's actually follow our transaction down the factory floor. We'll start with creation, step into the mempool, look at inclusion, observe the execution, wait for finalization, and wrap it all up by tracing a real transaction. Okay, let's kick things off with our very first stage, drafting the blueprint. You see, every single transaction starts its life as a local offline blueprint right on your machine. It doesn't actually live on the network yet. It's really just a file sitting on your computer or in your wallet waiting for your final approval. Here's the high-level, 5-step mechanized journey every transaction absolutely must survive to mutate the blockchain state. It goes from creation to propagation, inclusion, execution, and finally, finalization. Miss a single step here, the transaction just doesn't happen.
Now, what's really fascinating here is that at this creation stage, absolutely no persistent state has changed on the network, literally none. Your intent is merely captured in a local signature. This assigns the originating account and a super crucial sequence number called a nonce, which, if you remember, keeps all your actions in perfect, strict chronological order. All right, so we've got our blueprint. Next, we move on to broadcasting that intent to the world. So your transaction finally leaves the safety of your local machine and enters what is basically a noisy, highly competitive waiting room. We call this the mempool. It's essentially a peer-to-peer network pool where pending transactions compete against each other based on fee parameters and ordering rules. Picture a chaotic auction house. While sitting here, your transaction is highly visible to the entire world. Everyone can see your gas price and your knots. But, and this is absolutely key, it is still just an uncommitted intention. It hasn't changed any actual blockchain state yet.
Right, we've all stared blankly at our screens and asked, why on earth is my transaction stuck indefinitely in the pending pool? If you're running into this classic developer headache, it usually boils down to two things. Either your fee is just too low to grab a miner's attention, or you have a nonce gap where a previous transaction, maybe one you completely forgot about, hasn't been included yet. You're basically stuck in a traffic jam behind a stalled car. So how do we get out of that waiting room? That brings us to getting picked up. Finally, a block producer comes along and plucks your transaction right off the conveyor belt. And this table brilliantly illustrates exactly when the abstract magic of a transaction becomes a concrete, irreversible reality. Notice how the creation and propagation stages involve zero persistent change. It isn't until inclusion, when the transaction is officially recorded in a block body, that the gears actually lock into place, marking the exact point for execution. Let's talk about your nonce for just a second here. Imagine your current on-chain sequence number, your nonce, is exactly 7. Inclusion is the ultimate strict gatekeeper. When a miner picks up your transaction, the node checks the signature and checks that nonce. If your transaction claims to be nonce 7, but the network expects an 8, or maybe a 6, boom, rejected. If your nonce doesn't match the expected sequence exactly, your transaction is dropped from the block candidate entirely, no exceptions. But let's be optimistic and assume you got the nonce right. Now we move on to the factory floor itself, execution. Once you're included, the Ethereum virtual machine, the EVM, powers on to do the actual mechanical lifting. Here is exactly what happens under the hood. The EVM deducts your base gas costs, runs the contract bytecode, makes internal calls, writes data to storage, and finally spits out a receipt. Now the crucial point to remember here is that these state changes are applied atomically. Meaning, everything commits together or absolutely none of it does. It's a strict all-or-nothing deal. But wait, what happens if the transaction actually fails? Let's say a contract rule is violated right in the middle of execution. Do you get your gas back? Well, time for a painful uh-oh moment. If an internal rule fails, yes, your storage changes will roll back. But your spent gas, that is gone forever. Yep, there are absolutely no refunds in Web3. And guys, this is a vital concept to grasp. Even if the execution completely reverts and all your token transfers get canceled, the EVM still charges you for the computational work it did while trying to process it. And this is the part that catches a lot of people out. It permanently increments your nonce. So if your nonce was 7, it is now 8, even for a completely failed transaction. Wild, right?
Okay, moving down the line, we need to let the concrete dry. Let's look at finalization.
So your transaction is bolted into the block, it's executed, and the state has officially changed. But we really need to make sure this whole structure is stable. Finalization is this probabilistic period where accumulating block confirmations reduce the chance of a chain reorganization erasing your transaction. Until a sufficient number of confirmations pass, there is always a slight lingering risk that your committed state could be reorganized right back into a pending intent by the network. It's exactly like wet concrete. You've got to let it dry before you can build a house on it. Finally, let's wrap this up by looking at how we can trace all this in the real world.
Let's see how this entire life cycle builds into a totally practical workflow that you can use to diagnose your own smart contracts. Treat this timeline as your essential diagnostic pipeline by checking these exact checkpoints, from capturing your initial hash to query the mempool, all the way to fetching the execution receipt. You can prove exactly when and where your account fields mutated. It takes all the frustrating guesswork out of debugging. To pull this off, you'll use tools like public mempool explorers, specific RPC endpoints like ETH_transaction by hash, and debug trace endpoints. By querying these specific technical endpoints, you generate the concrete, annotated notes needed to prove your transaction's journey from an offline intent to a permanent on-chain reality. And that leaves us with a really interesting puzzle. How will a simple Ether transfer leave a completely different footprint on account persistence than a failed contract call? Ponder that as we prepare for the next lesson. We've laid out the assembly line today, and next time we'll look at the specific products coming off that line. Be sure to head over to forge.college to dive deeper into this and tons of other Web3 topics. Thanks so much for tuning into this Forge College Explainer, and I'll see you in the next one.